China's rebuilding after the Opium Wars did not begin with a single moment of awakening, but with the slow realization that a civilization thousands of years old was being pushed to the edge of collapse. The defeat in the 1840s shattered the illusion that the old imperial system could survive unchanged. Western gunboats forced open the ports, unequal treaties drained the treasury, and domestic rebellions nearly tore the country apart. But beneath the surface of humiliation, a deeper process emerged. The question of how a civilization with one of the world's longest continuous histories could adapt to a new global order without losing its identity. The self-strengthening movement marked the first attempt to answer that question. Chinese officials recognized that the state needed Western weapons and technologies, yet they also believed that China's cultural foundations, its institutions, ethics, and social structures, must remain intact. This belief was not arrogance, it was survival logic. China had endured invasions and dynastic collapses before, but it had always rebuilt by holding onto its core cultural continuity. Railways, arsenals, telegraph lines, foreign language schools, and modern naval academies were introduced, but they were placed within a framework still shaped by Chinese philosophy and governance. This hybrid modernization was imperfect, often resisted, and ultimately insufficient to stop further defeat, yet it planted the seeds for a new era. As foreign pressure intensified, the late Qing reforms attempted a more systematic restructuring. Constitutional experiments, administrative reforms, and the abolition of the civil service examination signaled that China understood the stakes. Without deep structural change, it would not survive. But the dynasty fell before these reforms could take full effect. The 1911 revolution ended imperial rule, yet the republic that followed remained fragmented. Still, even this chaotic period contributed to the rebuilding. New intellectual movements questioned China's past, debated democracy, science, and industrialization, and pushed society toward modernization. The May 4th movement accelerated this shift, exposing the crisis of cultural confidence while also sparking a search for new national identity. China's rebuilding from the Opium Wars was never just economic or political. It was profoundly civilizational. The question was how to modernize without becoming a replica of the West, how to adopt technology without surrendering sovereignty, how to reform society without erasing cultural memory. The country faced invasions, warlord divisions, political experiments, and ideological battles. Yet through it all, China maintained a continuity that other collapsing empires lacked. The resilience came from a long civilizational habit of absorbing shocks, adapting institutions, and renewing culture while preserving a sense of historical mission. By the time the Second Sino-Japanese War began, China was still struggling to define its path. But the national resistance transformed the fragmented society into a unified force for survival. Factories moved inland, universities relocated to remote regions, and millions of ordinary people participated in a national project that transcended class and region. The war brought immense destruction, but it also reinforced a civilizational identity, the idea that China could endure catastrophe and still rise again. After Japan's defeat in 1945, China's rebuilding entered its most decisive stage. The civil war that followed was not just a struggle for political control, but a confrontation between competing visions of how China should modernize. When the Communist Party unified most of the country in 1949, the leadership framed Reconstruction as the completion of a century-long response to humiliation. Land reform broke the old landlord system. Literacy campaigns reshaped education, and the early industrialization programs focused on building a self-sufficient national economy. These efforts did not erase hardship, but they fundamentally changed the structure of Chinese society. The idea was simple but ambitious. Rebuild a strong state capable of defending sovereignty and restoring dignity. Even with internal political upheavals and policy failures, the overarching direction did not change. China continued searching for a path that combined modernization with cultural and political continuity. This trajectory became clearer in the late 1970s when reform and opening up began. The shift was monumental not because China abandoned its past, but because it selectively absorbed global technologies, markets, and management systems while maintaining a distinct political and cultural framework. The economic zones on the coast, the rise of private enterprise, the reintroduction of foreign investment, and the rebuilding of higher education all signaled a new chapter in the reconstruction that began more than a century earlier. China was not imitating the West. It was using global tools to pursue its own civilizational revival. By the 1990s and early 2000s, China's transformation accelerated into what many described as an economic miracle. But in reality, it was not a miracle. It was the cumulative result of generations who refused to accept decline. The country leveraged its population, its diaspora networks, and its cultural emphasis on education and stability to integrate itself into global trade. Factories grew into supply chains, villages grew into megacities, and a century after gunboats forced China open, it became one of the most influential players in world economics. What looked like rapid growth from the outside was, in fact, the latest phase of a reconstruction process that had begun the moment China realized the Opium Wars threatened not just its territory, but its civilization. Throughout this entire journey, the continuity of Chinese civilization played a defining role. Unlike other societies fractured by colonialism, China retained its language, traditions, social structures, and historical consciousness. This continuity allowed each generation to build on the previous one. The memory of humiliation became motivation. The desire to restore cultural and national pride became policy. The rebuilding was not just material, it was psychological and civilizational. China's modern rise cannot be understood simply through GDP numbers or political reforms. It must be seen as the long, painful, and determined attempt to prove that a civilization with thousands of years of history could adapt to the modern world without losing itself. Today's China stands not as the end of this journey, but as the latest chapter. The nation continues to navigate global pressures, technological revolutions, and ideological challenges, just as it did in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The difference is that China now does so from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. The so-called miracle of China's rise is less about speed and more about endurance. It is the story of how a civilization survived invasion, division, and humiliation, yet continued to rebuild until it redefined its place in the world. It is a reminder that rebuilding is not an event. It is a continuous process driven by memory, identity, and an unbroken civilizational line stretching back thousands of years.